They said the storm would kill anyone stupid enough to fly into it. The radar screens painted it blood red. 40,000-foot towers of ice and lightning, wind shear that could snap an aircraft in half like a toothpick. Every weather service from here to the Canadian border was screaming the same warning: ground all flights, stay on the ground, do not attempt departure. But somewhere out there, beyond that wall of black clouds and horizontal rain, beyond the lightning that split the sky like veins of fire, a man was dying, bleeding out in a remote weather station where helicopters couldn't reach and fixed-wing aircraft had no business even trying. And that's when she walked into the hangar. No name on her jacket, no rank insignia, no call sign stitched across the chest, just a worn leather helmet, back that looked older than half the planes sitting in the fleet. And boots, those boots. They had seen more storms than most pilots see in a lifetime. Scuffed leather, oil-stained. The kind of boots that told stories without saying a word. The hangar smelled like hot hydraulics and wet asphalt. That particular scent that comes when a storm is close enough to taste. The kind of night when even seasoned veterans start reconsidering their relationship with pride and professional courage. Operation screens pulsed with angry red cells marking severe convective activity. Hail cores dense enough to shred aluminum skin like paper. Wind shear patterns that could drop aircraft like stones thrown from a cliff. Embedded lightning crackling through towering clouds that scraped the edge of space itself. The briefing board carried one phrase in stark block letters: ground unless essential. Those words represented the collective wisdom of meteorologists, air traffic controllers, and experienced pilots who understood that some nights belonged entirely to the sky's violent moods. The guys in the ready room, two pilots lounging near the coffee station with that casual superiority of insiders, observing obvious outsiders. They looked up when she walked in. One of them, coffee cup halfway to his lips. He grinned at his buddy. That knowing grin, that dismissive smirk. Storm tourist, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Instagram photo opportunities are probably down the hallway. His friend laughed, shaking his head like he'd seen this movie before and knew exactly how it ended. Give her 10 minutes, he added. She'll be back asking where the visitor restroom is. More laughter, light, mocking. Certain she wouldn't last. She didn't acknowledge them, didn't even glance their direction, just kept that steady stride toward the parked aircraft, like she had somewhere important to be and their opinions weren't part of the flight plan. A crew chief glanced up from his talk specifications, automatically cataloging the absence of identifying insignia before returning to his technical documentation. Visitor logs are over there, he said, chin pointing toward a standard authorization clipboard without making direct eye contact. She walked straight past the clipboard, straight to the aircraft. She ran one slow, deliberate hand along the wing's leading edge, feeling for stress cracks and surface imperfections that hangar lighting might conceal during routine visual inspection. Her touch was methodical, professional, the kind of inspection that suggested deep familiarity with PRE flight procedures. At the nose gear assembly, she knelt on the concrete and checked the scissor, link play by touch rather than relying solely on visual inspection. She examined the pitot tube cover and removed it herself, stowing the protective equipment with a specific securing knot. A small knot, the kind that only experienced maintenance personnel typically used. The crew chief noticed the knot and paused in his routine documentation. He looked at her hands again, then her boots. Really looked at them They weren't parade shine for ceremonial display. They showed the oil stains and scuff marks that came from working around operational aircraft in challenging environments, from kneeling on tarmacs and climbing into wheel wells and doing the kind of work that most people never see. His entire demeanor shifted. On the operations board, a medical evacuation call flickered from pending to urgent status. A remote weather station technician had suffered a serious fall with suspected internal bleeding. Helicopter assets were completely grounded by severe icing conditions. Fixed-wing aircraft faced prohibitive winds over the mountain ridge separating the mainland from the isolated facility. Command was wrestling with an impossible tactical choice: accept the human cost of sending no rescue assets, or risk additional lives by launching someone into atmospheric conditions that challenge the absolute boundaries of aircraft performance and pilot capability. Someone had to make a decision. Someone had to choose. She climbed the cockpit ladder and settled into the left seat with the kind of reverence that precision machinery deserve, not the theatrical ceremony that inexperienced pilots sometimes display for observers. just quiet respect. The right seat pilot arrived moments later, a capable, methodical officer, carrying a printed weather packet and wearing an expression that mixed professional skepticism with operational duty. He looked at the radar displays, looked at her, looked back at the displays. "We're not cleared for departure," he stated firmly, reviewing the deteriorating conditions displayed on multiple weather radar screens throughout the operations center. She reached toward the overhead control panel, fingers hovering without touching switches or controls, waiting, understanding that patience and proper timing often separated successful missions from catastrophic failures. Tao's voice crackled over the communication net, cutting through the ambient noise of the hangar. Medivac 1, hold for weather review and clearance authorization. Someone in the background, you could hear it clear as day over the open MIC, made a derisive sound. "No one's crazy enough to launch into that mess." She lowered her visor and traced the proposed route on a grease pencil. Navigation card, flying corridor, turning window, gap line through the score, approach using terrain masking. The route looked impossible. It probably was impossible. Then she did something strange. She tapped the instrument panel twice with her index finger. 2 quick taps. Precise timing. The right seater looked at her, confused, wondering if she was nervous or superstitious or just had some kind of PI flight ritual. Then he looked at the weather radar sweep, and his confusion transformed into something else entirely. His eyes went wide. Those 2 taps, they corresponded exactly, perfectly, with a brief opening in the storm's convective structure, a gap in the chaos, a window in the violence. 3 minutes wide, maybe less. Weather window opens in 3 minutes, she announced without looking up from her calculations. Voice calm as Sunday morning. We launch at 2 minutes if clearance comes through. The right seater stared at the radar sweep, watching that narrow gap appear exactly as she'd predicted. The crew chief, standing outside on the rain-slicked tarmac. He'd been watching through the canopy. He positioned wheel chocks without being asked and keyed the intercom system. "If you're committing to this launch, confirm intentions now." She simply raised her hand, palm steady, fingers together, a signal as traditional as aviation itself, conveying readiness without words or doubt. The hangar fell silent. Even the 2 coffee station pilots had stopped talking, stopped smirking, watching now with something that might have been the first hint of respect. Tao broke the operational stalemate with crisp professionalism. Medivac 1 cleared for immediate departure. Current winds 330 at 32, gusting to 41 knots. Microburst warning remains in effect for your departure corridor. Good luck. Medivac 1 copies clearance. The right seater responded, his voice tight with controlled tension. She advanced throttles. The aircraft began to roll, and they committed to a decision that couldn't be undone. The takeoff roll started smooth enough. Then the storm reminded them who owned the sky tonight. Rain hit the windscreen, like bullets fired from some invisible machine gun, positioned directly ahead. Horizontal rain, the kind that doesn't fall, it attacks. Visibility dropped to nearly zero. The centerline lights became vague suggestions rather than clear guidance. At 60 knots, the storm delivered its first serious punch, a crosswind gust that tried to weather vane the aircraft 30 degrees of heading. She corrected with control inputs so small, so precise, you'd miss them if you blinked. Tiny adjustments, surgical precision, the kind of flying that separated professionals from pretenders. Rotation speed. She pulled back on the yoke. It felt like trying to lift a building off its foundation, like the aircraft was welded to the runway, and the laws of physics had decided to take the night off. Positive rate. The right seater called out. Gear up. Landing gear retracted with mechanical precision. She maintained a shallow climb profile, staying beneath the wind shear layer that could flip them. Inverted in half a heartbeat. Then, exactly as predicted, the weather gap opened, just like a curtain being drawn by invisible hands. She increased pitch angle, climbing through the brief corridor of slightly less terrible conditions. Lightning stroked across the wing's end, brilliant white flashes that could blind or disorient inexperienced pilots. Thunder rolled through the airframe like the voice of God announcing displeasure. She didn't chase the dramatic flashes, didn't focus on the lightning that drew the eye and captured attention. Instead, she navigated toward the dark channels between convective cells, where rain fell steadily, but wind patterns remained relatively consistent and predictable. The right seater called out altitude and heading, deviations as instruments detected changes in atmospheric conditions, plus 200 feet, heading drifting left 5 degrees. She anticipated his calots, making trim adjustments a full breath before he finished announcing the numbers, correcting before the corrections were even verbalized. You've flown through this specific storm system before, he observed. Not really a question. More like dawning realization and growing respect. All storms are variations on the same fundamental themes, she replied, nudging power settings to thread a narrow atmospheric corridor that existed for mere seconds before conditions shifted again. The aircraft shuddered. Turbulence grabbed them and shook like a dog shaking a toy. She rode it out with minimal control inputs, letting the aircraft's inherent stability do most of the work, only intervening when absolutely necessary. Over the mountain ridge, where the radar returns became corrupted by ground clutter that smeared electronic images like spilled ink across display screens, the instruments became suggestions rather than reliable information. She switched to something else entirely, terrain memory, atmospheric intuition, understanding how winds wrapped around geological features, how valleys funneled airflow into concentrated streams of violence, how ridges created turbulent downdrafts that appeared without warning. She flew by feel now, by experience accumulated over thousands of hours in conditions that most pilots would never voluntarily enter. The right seater watched her hands on the controls, watched her scan pattern, watched the way she seemed to anticipate atmospheric changes before instruments could register them. He realized he was watching mastery, pure, undiluted expertise in action. 10 miles from the destination, the island's single runway beacon flickered to life through the storm like a lighthouse beam cutting through fog, a thin line of lights, creating a fragile welcome mat. Surrounded by black water and hostile weather conditions, crosswinds pushed against the aircraft like an enormous unseen hand attempting to force them of course. She held the crab angle, aircraft nose pointed 30 degrees off the runway centerline to compensate for wind drift. The runway grew closer. 5 miles, 3 miles, 1 mile. At the last possible second, she kicked the rudder straight with an input so gentle it felt like an apology to the machine. Main landing gear touched down with barely perceptible contact. Spoilers deployed automatically, disrupting lift. Thrust reversers engaged with mechanical precision, roaring against forward momentum. The aircraft decelerated smoothly despite standing water that covered the runway surface. On the rain-soaked ramp, medical personnel ran toward the aircraft with a stretcher, their movements urgent but professional, despite the sideways precipitation and gusting winds that threatened to knock them over. She remained strapped in, not relaxing her vigilance for even a moment, watching the storm's behavior, counting the intervals between lightning flashes and thunder, calculating how much worse conditions might get before they could attempt the return flight. The patient was loaded efficiently, strapped down, for lines secured, oxygen mask in place. The flight surgeon gave a thumbs-up signal, with eyes that communicated gratitude and desperate hope in equal measure. His expression said what words couldn't. "You're this man's only chance." She advanced throttles again, rolling back into atmospheric conditions that had grown more violent rather than less, as if the storm had been gathering strength during their brief respite, as if it was angry they'd beaten it once and wasn't about to let it happen twice. The return journey maximum tension. The return trip made the departure look like a pleasure cruise. The storm had intensified. Wind shear warnings multiplied across the instruments. Lightning frequency increased to the point where the cockpit strobed continuously. She changed altitudes with the precision of a master locksmith working combination tumblers, small increments, careful timing, waiting for atmospheric tumblers to align perfectly before making each adjustment. Up 500 feet, down 300 feet. Each altitude change was searching for that narrow band of slightly less terrible conditions. The right seater's hand gripped the armrest so tight his knuckles showed white even in the dim cockpit lighting. He'd flown through bad weather before, everyone had. But this was something else entirely. This was threading a needle while riding a mechanical bull during an earthquake. Then he exhaled slowly and let out one short laugh, pure disbelief mixed with a hint of hysteria. Operations is going to attribute this entire flight to luck rather than skill, he said. Let them believe what they need to believe, she replied calmly, adjusting trim with tiny inputs. Luck has a way of following proper procedures and careful preparation. Approach control contacted them with updated conditions that had deteriorated even further during their absence. Medivac 1, be advised runway surface now has standing water. Braking action reported as poor to nil. Winds currently variable at 35 gusting to 52 knots. Microburst activity continues. Recommend you consider alternate airport. The right seater looked at her. There was no alternate. Not with a critical patient on board. Not with minutes counting down. "We'll take the extended final approach," she responded, selecting the flight profile that traded dramatic efficiency for operational safety margins. The final approach corridor looked like flying through a tunnel constructed entirely of precipitation, walls of rain on both sides, ceiling of rain above, foundation of rain below. She tuned her senses to the aircraft's most subtle communications, the slight tremor in the control yoke that preceded wind shear by half a second, the harmonic vibration through the seat, rails that indicated power setting. Changes were needed, the way atmospheric disturbances announced themselves through rudder pedal feedback before instruments could register the changes. At 200 feet above ground level, still descending through the approach, a severe downdraft struck them. It felt like the hand of God reaching down and swatting them toward the ground. The vertical speed indicator pegged downward, altitude bleeding away fast, too fast. The right seater instinctively reached for controls, training and reflexes taking over. She anticipated his movement and added power first, smooth and immediate, maintaining the approach. Picture while refusing to let panic take root in either of their decision-making processes. "My aircraft," she announced softly, more courtesy than necessity, but essential for crew coordination. "Your aircraft confirmed," he replied, hands positioned to assist but trusting her judgment completely now. The landing flare was not theatrical demonstration, not some dramatic pull-up at the last second, just a carefully calibrated handshake between machine and liquid-covered runway. Tires found their intended contact points exactly where she planned. Thrust reversers engaged with mechanical precision. They rolled to a stop along the centerline lights that provided the only visual reference in the storm-darkened environment. The ambulance was already accelerating toward the hospital before they'd even cleared the active runway. Through rain-streaked windows, she could see the paramedic's facial expression transition from dread to cautious optimism. That subtle change that marked the difference between hopeless situations and manageable emergencies, between tragedy and survival. She taxied toward the hangar and shut down engines to the sound of rain beginning to ease. Storms sometimes behaved that way, like bullies who withdrew once they'd extracted their toll from the night. When she opened the cockpit canopy, ground crew members who had been laughing just hours earlier now stood motionless in the diminishing precipitation, silent, suddenly very careful about making eye contact or offering casual commentary. The two coffee station pilots stood near the hangar entrance, thermal cups forgotten in their hands, watching her climb down from the aircraft with expressions that had transformed completely from their earlier mockery. No one shouted congratulations or offered dramatic praise, because genuine respect doesn't arrive with noise and celebration. It manifests as the absence of mockery, the presence of serious attention. The right seat pilot unstrapped and simply studied her with professional curiosity tinged with something close to awe. "Where did you develop the ability to read atmospheric conditions with that level of accuracy?" he asked. She secured her helmet in its protective bag with the same methodical precision she'd shown throughout the entire flight. "A long time ago," she said quietly, from someone who didn't survive the learning process. That statement settled over the rain-soaked tarmac like a secondary weather system. A quiet pressure that was both honest and heavy, carrying implications that extended far beyond the current mission. Everyone within earshot understood immediately what she meant. She hadn't learned this expertise from textbooks or simulators. She'd learned it the hard way, from mistakes that cost someone their life, from lessons written in tragedy. Her post-flight maintenance notes were comprehensive, detailed, professional. Pitot heat system verified functional. Spoilers responding sluggishly underwater saturation. Left main brake system showing marginal performance. She had noticed every mechanical detail, every system anomaly, every subtle indication of potential problems, all while simultaneously saving a human life at operational speed. In the operations center, someone pulled up the radar replay data. The flight path told a story that numbers rarely captured completely. Microburst warnings navigated successfully. Wind shear episodes avoided through anticipation and timing. Null radar returns were instinct and experience, but bridge gaps in electronic information. The route represented a line drawn between two islands, one geographical, one constructed entirely of professional will and accumulated expertise. The chief pilot arrived, at the edge of the gathered crowd, carrying questions in his expression and authority in his bearing. He had heard the earlier laughter and casual dismissal from his pilots. Now he heard only respectful silence. He didn't ask for speeches or dramatic explanations, simply requested the checklist she'd used to navigate the storm. She handed him the grease pencil navigation card, smudged, practical, worn from handling, like a pocket prayer carried through countless similar situations. The simple markings represented a lifetime of accumulated knowledge distilled into essential elements. He studied it for a long moment, then slid it carefully into a plastic, protective sleeve as if it were made of fragile glass that might shatter with rough handling. "We'll add this to our standard procedures manual," he said. She shook her head with quiet firmness at the thinking behind it, not just the mechanics. Anyone can copy movements. Understanding why those movements work is what saves lives. He almost smiled, the first genuine expression she'd seen from him all night. "We will do exactly that," he promised. News came through the communication channels minutes later. Patient stabilized at the hospital. Just 3 words, but those 3 words completely rewrote the night's meaning and transformed desperate urgency into grateful relief. Someone who'd been dying was now going to live, because she'd walked into that hangar when everyone said it was impossible. By morning, the storm system had moved inland, leaving only wisps of clouds clinging to hangar doors like fading memories of the night's violence. The ground crew moved through their routines with the satisfied efficiency of people who had slept better than usual, knowing their aircraft had performed exactly when performance mattered most. The 2 pilots from the coffee station approached her before she left, carrying thermal coffee containers like peace offerings. They didn't offer verbal apologies for their earlier dismissiveness and mockery. Some things cut too deep for simple apologies to fix. Instead, they offered respect through careful listening and genuine attention to everything she said, through silence that acknowledged they'd been completely wrong about her. In the briefing room, the chief pilot had already pinned a laminated card to the official operations board, Storm Windows Standard Operating Procedures Interim, a distilled version of her grease pencil navigation, notes with margins provided for additional annotations and refinements. The right seat pilot from the previous night's mission had already begun adding observational details to the documented procedures. Minimal control inputs. Don't chase lightning flashes. Navigate channels of atmospheric consistency rather than fighting convective cells directly. His notes transformed subjective experience into transferable knowledge that could save future lives, that could turn one pilot's expertise into collective capability. No one dismissed feel as unscientific anymore. Instead, they wrote down every nuance and technique with careful precision, understanding that some expertise couldn't be fully captured in technical manuals but still needed to be preserved and transmitted to the next generation of pilots. A maintenance technician proactively replaced the left main brake system before marginal performance could compromise a less experienced pilot's safety margin. Someone else resealed the spoiler assemblies to prevent future water saturation issues. The storm had generated a comprehensive discrepancy list. The maintenance team systematically addressed every single item with renewed attention to detail. When the rescue patient's flight surgeon entered the hangar later that morning with an exhausted smile and gratitude nobody quite knew how to properly accept, the entire facility suddenly discovered urgent tasks that required immediate attention. Because gratitude can be overwhelmingly bright to look at directly, sometimes it's easier to acknowledge heroism through action rather than words. She accepted no ceremonial recognition, signed no commemorative items, posed for no photographs. Instead, she sat on an equipment, crate drinking water from a plain bottle, and unconsciously tracing runway patterns on the concrete floor with her boot. Centerline navigation, crosswind correction techniques, holding heading steady through turbulence. The patterns never left. The crew chief found her there as she was preparing to leave, standing by her aircraft, running his hand along the same wing she'd inspected so carefully the night before. "Can I ask you something?" he said, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than challenge. She nodded, waiting. "Were you scared up there, in that storm?" She looked at the sky, where morning light was breaking through scattered clouds, painting everything in shades of gold and pink that seemed impossible after the previous night's violence. "Every second," she said honestly. "But fear doesn't ground aircraft. Unpreparedness does. Being scared means you understand the stakes. Acting anyway means you trust your training more than your fear. She picked up her weathered helmet bag, walked toward the exit with that same steady stride she'd arrived with. Behind her, the hangar was already buzzing with activity again. Different now, quieter, more focused, because they'd all seen what real expertise looked like when lives hung in the balance. They'd learned that the loudest voices in the room aren't always the most capable. They'd discovered that sometimes the most dangerous pilot in the sky, the one you absolutely want on your team when everything goes wrong, is the one nobody saw coming, the one with no name on her jacket, no rank to advertise, no call sign to announce, just a lifetime of storms in her eyes and the quiet competence to fly through hell itself and bring people home. Real courage doesn't compete with atmospheric violence. It collaborates with available possibilities and makes everything else irrelevant through superior preparation and flawless execution. She didn't fly into that storm because she was fearless. Nobody who understands storms is truly fearless. She flew into it because someone was dying, and she possessed the specific combination of skill, experience, and determination to bring them home alive. That's not fearlessness. That's something better. That's competence meeting courage exactly when it matters most. The coffee station pilots never made jokes about storm tourists again. The crew chief added a small notation to his personal maintenance log that night. Some pilots you work for, others you work with, a rare few you'd follow anywhere, and somewhere in a hospital room. A weather station technician opened his eyes, saw his family gathered around, and had absolutely no idea that his life had been saved by someone whose name he'd never know, by a pilot who walked into impossible conditions and made the impossible look routine, by a woman who let her expertise speak louder than any call sign ever could. If this story made you stop and think, if it reminded you that real heroes don't always announce themselves, if you believe that quiet competence speaks louder than arrogant assumptions, then hit that like button right now. Subscribe to Silent Warriors, because this channel is built for people who understand that strength isn't always loud, courage isn't always visible, and the most powerful warriors are often the ones standing in the shadows, ready when the moment demands everything they have. Drop a comment and tell me about a time someone underestimated you and you proved them completely wrong. I read every single comment, because the world needs more stories about people who do the impossible without asking for permission or applause. Stay strong, stay silent, and never let anyone's laughter define your capability. This is Silent Warriors. We see you, we respect you, and we'll be back with another story that proves quiet strength changes everything.